Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor. Pastor Sullivan here answering your questions. If you've got something you'd like to ask the pastor, shoot me an email, atpholycross@gmail.com. Also check out the links we have in the video description below. Today's question, dear pastor, is being in a denomination wrong because of St. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13, and Jesus' words of unity in John 17, verse 11 and 21. Is it therefore wrong to be called a Lutheran, or to say the Lutheran faith, as I've heard said? I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Luther. Is that what's going on? Also, did Luther really say, when his followers started calling themselves Lutherans, don't call yourselves after me, I'm a bag of worms? Also, is there a difference between denominationalism and sectarianism? I've been against denominationalism for almost all my Christian walk of these years, preferring just to be called Christian. But I'm going through a transition right now, and I'm interested in learning about Lutheranism, and this is one point that's bugging me. I also have a friend that strongly believes this about denominations and would cringe if I became Lutheran, quoting these verses against me. He would point out that Christ's body is not divided, and denominations create a sense of exclusivism among Christians, such as, I'm this and you're not. He would even go as far to say that the Greek word heresis, heresy of Galatians 5:19, describes not just damnable doctrinal error, but denominations and sects, because of the use of the word in Acts 26:4. Thus, according to him, making denominationalism a damnable sin. The thought of this really makes me cautious. Please help me shed some light on this. Yeah, I got you. Okay. So first of all, working from this here, let's try something different to get some perspective. I don't like the word denominations for church bodies. I understand why they have that name, but I don't like it because it makes church bodies, it makes churches interchangeable. What else exists in denominations in our world? Well, paper money, currency. Bills come in ones, fives, tens, 20s, 100s, 50s. I don't know if there's anything bigger than that, but they're all interchangeable. So 520s make a $100 bill. So do 10 tens or 100 ones. And people often think of church denominations like they do denominations of currency, as if they're all interchangeable. That they all teach basically the same thing with only minor variations, and that those are usually in the area of practices and traditions. And if we think about denominations like this, then they serve no purpose whatsoever except to divide Christianity into meaningless sects. So let me suggest a different way of thinking and speaking about this. Let's replace the word denomination with the word confession, as in a confession of the Christian faith. Different denominations exist because there are different confessions of the Christian faith. Every church doesn't basically teach the same thing. A Baptist teaches a Baptist confession of the Christian faith. A Calvinist adheres to a Calvinian confession of Christianity, and a Lutheran ideally should be teaching the Lutheran confession of the faith. And now, to make matters worse, we're neck deep in the non-denominational movement. This movement only makes sense if denominations are viewed as preferences rather than confessions of faith. And I'll be honest, many denominations within Christianity contribute to this way of thinking because they de-emphasize doctrinal differences and they embrace or emphasize the things they have in common with other denominations. But by downplaying and denying doctrinal differences, church bodies have watered down their confession of the faith almost to the point of believing nothing in some cases. This is why people generally don't know that different churches actually have different teachings. And it's not just about external things, practices and traditions. If we think about non-denom churches as non-confessional churches, then it makes sense when we see each one's teaching is determined by either the current pastor or by some governing board, not by an unchanging public confession of the Christian faith. All this is why it's not a sin to say, I'm a Lutheran, or I confess the Lutheran confession of the Christian faith. Although using the words the Lutheran faith is kind of sketchy. Don't do that. Now, I'm a Lutheran and a Lutheran pastor because I believe that the Lutheran confession of the Christian faith is the common Christian faith. Now, is the name Lutheran ideal? Well, not at all. And you're right, Luther didn't care for people being called Lutherans. And it was not Lutherans themselves that started calling them that. It was actually first used by Johann Eck as a pejorative, as a slam, by Luther's most vicious papal rival, Johann Eck, during the early years of the Reformation. So Luther had this to say. He said, I ask that my name be left silent, and people not call themselves Lutheran, but rather Christians. Who is Luther? The doctrine is not mine. I've not been crucified for anyone. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 3, 4, and 5 would not suffer that the Christians should call themselves of Paul or Peter, but Christian. How should I, a poor stinking bag of worms, become so that the children of Christ are named with my unholy name? It should not be, dear friends. Let us extinguish all factious names and be called Christians, whose doctrine we have. The Pope's men rightly have a factious name because they are not satisfied with the doctrine and name of Christ and want to be with the Pope, who is their master. I have not been and will not be a master. Along with the church, I have the one general teaching of Christ, who alone is our master. Now notice what Luther's not saying. He's not saying that all Christians are teaching the same thing. The Pope's men, for instance, he says, they have a factious name, the Roman Catholic Church, because their master is the Roman bishop, the Roman Pope, and they follow his doctrine, not Christ's. Luther is saying, I'm teaching the common Christian faith, the apostolic teaching set forth in Scripture. Therefore, those who follow this doctrine simply need to be called Christians. This is what St. Paul wrote of to the Corinthians then. Because when they said things like, I'm of Peter, Paul, Apollos, Christ, they're speaking out of party spirit. They're not saying Paul, Apollos, Peter, and Christ are all teaching different doctrines, but rather they're all teaching the same things. And since they are all teaching the same doctrines, the Corinthians are simply aligning themselves with their favorite preacher, not different confessions of the faith. The same is true of those of whom Paul speaks in Philippians 1:16, those who preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my chains. So those folks that Paul's referencing, they're not teaching a different doctrine than Paul and Christ. They're preaching the same doctrine, but in order to draw followers away from Paul to themselves. So the substance of their teaching was the same as Paul's, but the motive was where the difference was. So denominationalism isn't what's going on in 1 Corinthians or Philippians 1:16 for that matter. Now, heresy can be used two ways in the Scripture, and we cover that, I believe, in the video on heresy. But real quick, heresy, as it's used in the book of Acts, simply means different parties, usually within Judaism. And so the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and even the Nazarenes then are called sects. But heresy, as St. Paul mentions it, as he uses it in Galatians, is a doctrine different from the apostolic doctrine set forth in Scripture. That is sin, because it is the choice of doctrine that isn't found in Scripture. Now, does this mean that belonging to a denomination is sin? Well, if that denomination is built around the private opinions and teachings of a pastor or a church board that can change over time, then yeah, I think you're on shaky ground. But belonging to a denomination because you believe that its confession of the faith is the common Christian faith, the Catholic, the universal faith of Scripture, then no, it's not a sin. Denominations, or rather confessions of the faith, they may very well create a sense of exclusivism, but they do so because people should be convinced that their confession of the faith isn't just some private opinion of somebody, but rather it is the common Christian faith taught by Christ and the apostles in Holy Scripture. Now, what about Christian unity then? Well, all who believe in the gospel have the invisible unity for which Christ prays in John chapter 17, a unity with him and the Father and with one another. Since faith is invisible, the unity of all true Christians is invisible as well. Now, outward unity then is determined by our outward, our public confession of the faith, which consists not only of the words that come out of our mouth, but also things like our church membership. So to say things like, I'm going to be above the fray of denominationalism, that's to say, I'm not going to pick a confession of faith. Typically, even non-denom churches, they still have somewhat of a confession. They still confess a doctrine. Typically, though not always, it's Arminianism and revivalism, and then the theological eccentricities of the current pastor. But they still, even though they are non-denominational or non-confessional churches, they're still confessing something. And so that's why it's ultimately impossible to say, I'm going to be above the fray of denominationalism. At that point, you're just saying, my private opinions, that's the Christian faith. Now, it would be great if there weren't different confessions of the faith. It would be great if people didn't mix falsehood and opinion with the truth of the apostles' doctrine. But that ain't the world that we live in. Even in Jesus' day, people confessed different things about him. Some thought he was John the Baptist, some Elijah, others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And so this is simply the reality of the sinful world in which we live. If we think of denominations as confessions of the faith, though, then we see just how important it is that we search out and belong to one who confesses the Christian faith as taught by Christ and the apostles. In the end, like it was for Paul in 1 Corinthians, it's not about a name, it's about the doctrine and whether or not the doctrine is true. Hope this helps. We'll catch you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.